Hello and welcome to session 2 of the training in human rights due diligence. We are going to make a deep dive into the following issues. We have seen in the first session how to identify our impacts in relation to the chain of activities, to the value chain. And what we will see today is how to prioritize those impacts and how the consultation processes are key to carry on this prioritization. We will also finalize the session with some examples of sectorial initiatives that might inspire you as a group working on human rights due diligence and how other sectors and other initiatives are fulfilling what is a very interesting way to confront the challenges in a particular sector. So let's start today with this pathway towards the prioritization of impacts. So the objective of today's training is to gain practical experience in applying key tools for prioritization and to also stress the need to consult when we want to end up with a very wide and useful and meaningful prioritization process. So what, as just as a reminder of the previous session, what is expected of companies in relation to human rights? So there are several responsibilities within the responsibility of respecting human rights. The first one is avoid infringing the rights of others and address these adverse impacts in which a company may be involved. All these considering the way we consider human rights has to be carried out from a very wide perspective. And this means that we need to apply to this exercise all internationally recognized human rights. This is very important. When we talk about the expectation of respect from companies, we mean a much broader scope of human rights rather than just labor rights. We are talking about how companies impact on the rights of communities, on the right of users and clients, etc. It also means that we have to take a look not only at the current impact, but also at what could be potential impacts. And these mean that what is expected from companies is that they have this preventative approach to those potential impacts. And these potential impacts and current impacts might be linked to the operations and products and services of a company, but also the impacts that are taking place through a business relationship. And that means that we have to have a look at our chain of activities, our value chain, to map these relationships and see the connection of these potential or current or actual impacts also through these business relationships. And respect to human rights has to do with company operations or the link with how the supply chain, the value chain is operating for that company. And it has nothing to do with how a company contributes to a community, to their workers from a philanthropic perspective. So this is something completely different from what we are talking about here in this course, which is how to prevent and mitigate and remediate any potential and actual impact, negative impact that is linked to our operations and products and also our value chain. So how to prioritize impacts? So as you already know, the first step is to identify these impacts, and a way of doing this, an easy way of doing this, is by identifying and defining our chain, our value chain. So how all the steps that are between the capture of the fish and the calamaris, and how at the end this is bought by a client. So we need to first identify this value chain, and then we will be able to prioritize those impacts. So the first thing is to think about this value chain scheme and to find out as much as possible all the details that are linking the segments of this value chain with different people, with different actors, with these different management system processes, etc. So when we have these, we have already seen in session 1 that what we have to look at is when an action eliminates or reduces an individual's ability to enjoy their human rights. And this means that for that, we need to really identify all the activities within our own operations, but also our value chain, understanding the risks in each country of operation and considering any vulnerable groups, which can range from employees in our subcontractors, companies, or communities that are mainly made of fishermen, migrant workers, etc. So vulnerable groups are at higher risk of being exposed to adverse impacts because of their circumstances. And this is something that we need to take into account when identifying these impacts. For example, in the identification of impacts in the sector, we know that the fishing sector is one of the industries where forced labor is most widespread. And this is also globally. This is something that we can find globally in the fishing sector. It is also a sector. The fish is also among the 10 products with the highest number of children working. So this gives us a sense of the relevance of these human rights, due diligence, and the need to identify very accurately where are those impacts taking place and who are the right holders affected. For example, if we study the Indonesia work in the fishing sector, we find all these kind of impacts that we can see on the slide. And this goes, as we mentioned before, from child labor to forced labor, withholding of identifying documents, no payments of the salary, health and safety violation, physical abuse, and so on. So these could be potential and actual impacts in our value chain. So how to prioritize impacts when we have end up with a quite wide list and long list of potential and current impacts? There are two ways, two criteria to assess this prioritization. And these two criteria are the degree of severity and the probability. And within severity, we have to look at three elements: the type of right which is impacted, and here the question is, what specific human rights are being impacted, and what are the most severe ones? The scope, how many people does it impact? How my operations are impacting those people, and how many people, and if there are vulnerable groups precisely in any of these, among any of these affected groups or people. We also have to look at to what extent can the rights that have been impacted be returned to the right holders. And this is the factor of remediability of the impact. So how to measure severity? We have to measure according to these three elements: type of right, the scope, and the remediation. In relation to probability, which is also the criteria to prioritize our impacts, we have to also look at what's the probability for an impact to take place. And this will depend on the nature of the business relationship, the nature of the context of operation, the nature of the business activity, and also the presence of vulnerable groups. We know that the presence, for example, of migrant workers is increasing our probability of having human rights impacts, because these are vulnerable groups that don't speak the language, that they don't know what are the rights they have, they are due to enjoy. And these are particular circumstances for other actors to take advantage of these situation, these circumstances, and increase the probability of having those impacts. So, as mentioned before, what to consider to evaluate the probability. So we have to really look at all these different circumstances. So what is the profile of our commercial relationships? Are these partners, commercial partners? Do they have a specific due diligence in place? Are we operating in a very corrupted country, or a country where the legislation is practically not implemented in practice? Is there a presence of vulnerable groups in a way that is connected to our activity? And that's why we insist in that the probability also had to look at the sector and the specific activity we are involved in, directly or through our supply chain. And are there prevention and mitigation measures? That means that the existence of these prevention and mitigation measures will lower the probability of occurrence of an impact. So the objective of this prioritization process is to end up with a short list of priority priority impacts. Of course, these priority impacts should always look at the more severe human rights impacts, such as forced labor, child labor, and also impacts on the security, physical security of workers, and also, of course, questions related to the minimum wages and sexual and physical abuse. So we should end up with a list of key prioritized impacts that needs urgent action. So these top of the list impact need to be addressed in an urgent action with urgent measures to really end up and seize these impacts as soon as possible. And then we will have the medium prioritized impacts, which will need to be addressed. So with this, we want to give you the sense of urgency for those very top severe impacts. This is very important to take into account. So the risks when identifying and prioritizing impacts is the first risk is overlooking relevant potential impacts. For example, one activity that is commonly overlooked when mapping risk is transportation, but this activity often involves high risk of accidents and other human rights abuses. Focusing too much on known risks. The added value of a good prioritization is precisely to look at those invisible risks that we might have in our value chain, but which are out of the radar. And in that sense, involving external stakeholders to identify this invisible risk is an essential action that companies should take. And the sources of information should be legitimate to give us the real picture of what's going on. So not all sources of information are correct, are legitimate enough to give us the essential information about this first-hand knowledge or insight that we need in the phase of prioritization. So in regard to this exercise, this prioritization exercise, we want to stress the relevance of a consultation process. And these consultation processes should take place all over the due diligence system and process. So we need consultation, and this is something we want to stress very insistingly. We have these consultation that should take place throughout the due diligence process, not only to define our policies, but also to identify those impacts, prioritize them, also to validate the measures we are going to implement to prevent, mitigate, or cease these impacts, and of course to monitor and communicate to all stakeholders internally and externally what is our progress, what are our difficulties in relation to our human rights due diligence process. So the consultation will be meaningful if it involves affected groups. It will be meaningful and useful if we have the ability to interact with these stakeholders, these right holders, in an inclusive way. And it will be key also to not let anyone or any vulnerable group aside. And for this, the consultation of experts might be useful to really understand what are the right holders linked with our operations and our value chain. So meaningful consultation means that we should start this dialogue, this consultation, from the very first steps of this business relationship, of this new operation. It should serve to understand the real and potential impacts, especially the most vulnerable, and it requires an ongoing participation of all those right holders and their representatives. So benefits of the consultation and meaningful consultation is the best and only way to understand our risks. It is crucial to complement and test our hypotheses that come from desk research, that come from our knowledge and our intuition. So we really need to have these consultations to validate these hypotheses. And it also helps us arise questions, issues that would otherwise go unnoticed or underestimated. It helps identify impacts that might not be immediately visible or obvious. But this needs to be a proactive and ongoing engagement that will also help set the measures to close the gaps and to really address the identified issues. So the benefits and the impact of meaningful consultation is key for during all the due diligence process, but in particular for the identification and prioritization of impacts. We would like to end this session by presenting some sectoral initiatives that have been interesting in, for example, in the fishing sector, but also in other sectors which have been confronted to many challenges for the last decades, like, for example, the garment sector. And these sectorial activities, as you will see in the following examples, are tackling common identification barriers for a sector or common difficulties in addressing an impact, a potential impact, an actual impact. And many of them have shown a lot of impact. For example, one of the most recognized sectoral initiative has to do with the Accor agreement in Bangladesh after the Rana Plaza tragedy. And this initiative has succeeded in preventing other potential building fires and also protecting the building safety of factories in Bangladesh. And it's also being extended to Pakistan. And it's really an initiative that allowed the government of Bangladesh, the brands in the textile sector, the ILO, to come together and define what would be the rules for safety, for safer buildings in Bangladesh. Another initiative has to do with the Responsible Mica initiative, which is linked to the cosmetic sector. When the sector is aware of the impacts of sourcing mica from different countries. So this is another initiative that allows the companies in the sectors to discuss, to find ways to source in a more responsible way from different countries, but from a sectorial perspective. Then we have this initiative in the tea sector, which is based on contractual clauses, which is also a way to address and start working as a sector on these challenges in the supply chain. And of course, we have other initiatives. So, for example, in the cocoa sector, and at the end, these initiatives might be helpful to better understand the challenges. What's the challenge in sourcing from a country? What are the root causes that all the companies operating or sourcing from this country are confronted with? But it's also a way to discuss potential measures to prevent and mitigate these impacts from a platform which is where the interests of different companies in the sector are converging far away from competitive matters. So the companies are really understanding that addressing those challenges on their own might not be the best solution. So to end with this session, what are the key takeaways? So identifying and prioritizing impacts might not be an easy task. And this is an ongoing task that should be improved regularly, and how this improvement will come from. This improvement will come from these consultation processes, understanding really in detail the details and the challenges, the human rights challenges in every segment of our value chain. So it can be complex at first, but engaging with stakeholders, with experts, will help us progress in a continuous manner, but also find ways to improve our approach to these challenges. So this is a task we can improve over time. So don't feel overwhelmed, because this is something that you just need to start with, and the start of thinking about impacts in this way will also give you a lot of learnings on how you should proceed to prevent and mitigate these impacts. So engagement with stakeholders is key, and sectoral initiatives might increase your influence and have and provide you with a greater capacity to generate change. Thank you so much for your listening.